Thank you for participating in the 9th Annual Black Star Film Festival. We would like to thank our funders and individual donors, as well as our network of producing and community partners. This panel is presented by Color of Change. The runtime for this panel is 60 minutes. Please follow us on all social media platforms at Black Star Fest and use the hashtags BSFF20 and BlackStar20SoLit. We hope you have a wonderful time during the 2020 Black Star Film Festival.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Intimate Histories, Archival Approaches in Time. I'm Farah, the panel producer at Black Star, and it's a great pleasure to introduce the brilliant minds, some of my personal North Stars, who are participating in this conversation. Our moderator, Maori Karmael Holmes, founded Black Star in 2012 and serves as its artistic director and CEO. Maori is a filmmaker, curator, writer, and cultural worker who was recognized as one of Black public media's 40 game changers for 40 years and is a 2019 Soros Equality Fellow. Her writing has recently appeared in The Believer, Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, and How We Fight White Supremacy, a field guide to Black resistance. Maori serves as media maker in residence at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, curator at large at the Annenberg Center for the Performing Arts, and a creative executive with Blackbird. We welcome Garrett Bradley, an award-winning filmmaker working across narrative, documentary, and experimental modes to address themes such as race, class, familial relationships, social justice, Southern culture, and the history of film in the United States. Garrett has previously screened at Black Star, and in January of 2020 became the first Black American woman to receive the award for Best Director Documentary at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival for her first feature-length film, Time, which of course is the animating focus of today's conversation. We're thrilled to be joined by artist, organizer, writer, educator, and political strategist Patrisse Cullors, who is an LA native and co-founder of the Black Lives Matter Global Network and founder of the grassroots, Los Angeles-based organization Dignity and Power Now. Patrisse is the best-selling author of When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir, and the faculty director at Prescott College of a new social and environmental arts practice MFA program that she has developed. Patrisse is also a staff writer and actor on Freeform's Good Trouble, and for the last 20 years has been advocating on the front lines of criminal justice reform, leading the Reform LA Jails Yes on Our campaign, a ballot initiative that was passed by a 73% landslide victory in March 2020. We also give a warm welcome to Saidiya Hartman, a professor at Columbia University, 2019 MacArthur Fellow, and scholar whose major fields of interest include African American and American literature and cultural history, slavery, law, and performance studies. Saidiya's work traces the afterlives of slavery in modern American life and rescues from oblivion stories of sparsely documented lives that have been systematically excluded from historical archives. She is the author of Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, and Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which uses rich intertextual analysis to explore the interior lives of Black women who fled the South and moved to northern cities in the early 20th century. Finally, we welcome Imani Perry, a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, a scholar of law, literary, cultural, and gender studies, and an author of creative nonfiction, including Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, and Breathe, A Letter to My Sons. Imani's writing and scholarship primarily focuses on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination, crafted in response to and resistance against the social, political, and legal realities of domination in the West. She seeks to understand the processes of retrenchment after moments of social progress and how freedom dreams are nevertheless sustained. Imani's future planned projects include an examination of African American theories of law and justice and a meditation on the color blue in Black life.
Wow. Thank you all so much for joining us. For some of you, for Patrisse and Garrett, it's very early, so we appreciate you getting up this morning. But Garrett, I want to say that I am so blown away by your film, and I imagine that other people are, although I don't want to speak for them. And I'm so excited that each of you said yes to participating in this conversation. There's so much to unpack, so I think we should get started right away. I do also want to add that there will be a Q&A at the end. So those of you who are watching in real time on Facebook, please post your questions in the comments section, and we'll do our best to incorporate them. So I want to start with asking Patrisse, Saidiya, and Imani, what resonated with you when you viewed the film? And, you know, personally, in a scholarly sense, or related to your professional practice, how did the film make you feel? I'll pick on Imani.
Okay. You know, it's an incredibly affecting, emotionally speaking, piece, and also just really a kind of, I think, an extraordinary achievement aesthetically and artistically. So, you know, I kept thinking about time, of course, in addition to the title, but all of the multiple registers on which we experience time. You know, of course, there's the doing time, right? And then there's the presence of nostalgia and regret, the sort of aspirations of the past that were dashed, the hopes that were dashed, and then the anticipation of freedom, right? Looking forward, but also the anxiety and the kind of reproduction, the repetition of the cycles of disappointment every time parole is denied. And so it emotionally, you really experience all of the various ways that we encounter time. So these are not our lives, but there's a really deep resonance there. And then add that to the kind of the time traveling of the camera with the home movie. So it becomes this narrative collage, which I also think is a point of entry for the viewer, even though this is a very particular story and it's an emotional point of entry, even though it's a story that has huge political significance, right? The kind of the interior life of what it means to confront the injustice of incarceration. So, yeah.
Thank you. Patrisse, how about you?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think what's always important when I'm watching a film is how it lands on me. And I think this film, as someone who has a very intimate experience with the carceral state, was deeply moving. Oftentimes needing to pause, cry my eyeballs out, and then come back to it, and just be present for the crisis that is at hand. And I think as someone who is in this work day in and day out, while I'm not numb to the impact of incarceration, there's something about the way this film is delivered that makes you feel like you're living in it, you're living inside of it, and you're experiencing what each of the characters are experiencing. And I just think it's so important, especially right now, that we are continuing to have films that remind the world that we're human beings, and the impact that the carceral state has on a human body, on a human psyche, on a human spirit. And I did the unfortunate thing and went back and watched, I don't know if you all remember the film Cullors, awful film about LA gangs, and I was like, wow, like it was a campaign for the Reagan administration. It was a campaign for the Bush administration. It was literally the bastardization of what was happening in Los Angeles. And this film is the direct opposite of that and lands you into this couple's life in a way that is undeniably beautiful and painful. And I don't know how anybody can, walk away from this film and not want to take action. And I think that an action that actually moves us closer to freedom. And that's what came up for me watching this film.
Yeah, thank you. Saidiya?
Yeah, I think I, want to echo Patrisse and Imani's comments. I mean, the character of intimacy in the film is just like emotionally so powerful. Intimate archive, just beautifully defines it. And I think that the way it's constructed using the family movies also have implications for how the story's narrated, right? So we never get the outside framing of what it means to live like stolen time, to live in this context of captivity and loss. Uh, in my own work, I talk a lot about free indirect discourse, but there's a kind of free indirect camera that Garrett uses that I so love, and that's about the blending of her directorial voice, Sybil's narratorial voice, and all of the characters and people in the film. So as we enter it, we are inside the embrace of that sociality, and we're seeing and experiencing the pressures that impact and violate it. But there's something about the intimate address, which is also consequences of state violence. We understand that time, is an instrument of punishment, right? That yes, the state can steal our time, can steal our lives, but yet there is this. And the thing that I'm struck by, I think across your corpus, Garrett, and I was thinking about this film in relationship to the earlier film Alone, is the quality of subjective time in your work. And it is, it has a kind of a dreamlike quality. So we, as viewers, are in this wave of experience with those that we're watching. So we're with them. And to do that, I think, is to be involved in a kind of the radical imaginative work of abolition, because we don't see them as, an abstract social profile. We don't see them as a case. We don't see them as an issue. We see what it means for Black life to unfold under threat and danger, and the potential of an annihilation. But yet there's that which exceeds it. So thank you for it, because it's exquisite.
It really is. I like that word, exquisite. And that's exactly what this film is. Garrett, can you share a little bit about the process of making this film? I know we got into it a little bit in our Q&A for people who were able to watch it. And also, we should let people know, if you have festival passes or had a pass for the 24th, because we had technical difficulties, you can still watch the film through the end of today. So we really encourage you to do that. But yeah, talk about the process of making it. How did you meet Fox and Rob? And also in that, can you talk about when Fox shared this trove of archival footage with
Mm.
Yeah. Well, first, I just really quickly want to just take a moment to thank everybody this morning. I'm like feeling very emotional, and I really appreciate, this is such a brilliant group of people, and really honored to be here and to be honoring the Richardson family and the film, and what's going on in the world right now, and the ways in which we can change it. I made a short film called Alone, which was a 13-minute op doc. And I think I might actually, Mary, if it's cool, just give a little bit of background on how that film came to be, because I think it actually is important in understanding how time came as well. So anyone, those of you who are watching who are interested in making a short film with op docs, you can just go online and submit an idea, which is what I did. I didn't know anybody at the New York Times. They responded, and I was in the midst of kind of bearing witness to two very good friends of mine. In 2014, I made a film called Below Dreams, which was my first feature-length film, narrative film, that was cast almost entirely off of Craigslist in New Orleans. And in the process of making that film, I stayed very close with Desmond and became even closer with his partner, Lon. And about 6 years after that film had been made, Desmond was arrested and was awaiting trial for about a year and a half in a private prison in Monroe, Louisiana. And Lon, in the midst of that, was trying to figure out how to determine a future for herself, for them as a couple, for them as a family, and had very little resource or support in terms of just basic advice and being able to talk to people without the judgment and sort of stigma of what it meant to be involved with somebody who was incarcerated. And this is noted pre-trial, right? So he's just awaiting trial for a year and a half. And so I had thought of that film actually as really just being a facilitation of conversations between Lon and other women, and allowing it to be an intergenerational dialogue where she could actually get advice about what to do. And so I contacted an organization called FLIC, Friends and Families of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children, and Gina Womack, who was the co-founder and director of the organization, picked up and said, "You just have to speak with Fox Rich." And at that point, Robert had been incarcerated 19 years at Angola. And so Fox is actually Fox is in alone for about 7 seconds at the end of that film, and makes a very vivid connection between slavery and the prison industrial complex. And I got to know Fox in the process of making that film. And it was really important to me to think about, once Alone had come out into the world, had gone to festivals, was available online, had done well in terms of a critical response, it had won an award. But to me, there was a danger in it becoming sort of this monolithic experience that film in and of itself would stand for the voice of many other families and women that were going through this. And there's 2.3 million people, I think, that are incarcerated today, at least. So there's, if not double, triple that number that are also affected by this, which means that there are many, many stories and many, many films that can be told that are speaking to this in a unique and diverse way. And what really struck me was that Fox was a woman who was not only older than Lon, but had actually moved through the system in a very different and unique way, all into herself. And so it felt important to extend the conversation and to honor the unique way in which her family was maneuvering this as a sister film to Alone, you know? And so I started shooting it thinking it would be a short film. And then I think around the last day of filming, when I had felt like, funding was running out, there were all these reasons why you have to stop filming. And I remember telling Fox, "Okay, I'll be back, and I'll show you the film, when I think I've got something to show you." And she handed me 19 years worth of mini DV tapes that she had filmed throughout the course of her life and the family's life. And she herself hadn't looked at them since she had been shooting it in the 90s, and just said, "Maybe this will be useful to you. I don't know." And it was. It completely cracked open a whole other universe and dimension of the film, I think, in many ways that folks here have so beautifully articulated and generously articulated, in ways that I myself, as a filmmaker, alone couldn't have done. It really is it's a collaboration in my mind.
Yeah, thank you. Can you also share the time, from the beginning of sort of when you started the short to coming back to the archival footage, how long that took?
Yeah, it was such a funny time. I Concordia Studios had partnered with New York Times, So I was able to get funding support through them and editorial support for the first time. I mean, I was actually able to work with an editor instead of cutting myself, and had an editing bay that I could work in instead of my bedroom, which was amazing. And so we were kind of in the process of cutting a short film. And then when we were looking, like when we actually started transcribing all of the footage, I think it was maybe 100 hours. And when you're working through archive, and I'm so curious to hear, Saidiya and Imani, like what your experience is like as well. But from a visual standpoint with film, I try to watch everything without having an agenda behind it as much as possible, just in a really, and then you start to build that agenda and become a little bit more precise about what you're looking at. So it was a lot of watching and rewatching. And so we were kind of in the midst of that. Like, I think I was in a bit of a standstill of like, okay, I've had this very specific idea of what this film is, how it's going to look, how it's going to feel, working with zoom lenses, working with Dutch angles, having it be in black and white. And now you have this incredible thing that just fucks all that up, which is color, like grainy archive, and how do I even incorporate these things? So in the process of thinking about that and trying to work through the formal elements of that and the narrative elements of it, Fox said that there was a really good chance that he had another parole hearing coming up, and she felt like it felt different, and we'd been through that process obviously over the course of making the film, and for her over the course of, at that point, 21 years. But it was important that we rallied and be there and see what happened. And so we then shot for another 3 weeks, and that covered both the parole hearing and his release. And it was really important for me, I think, at that point to say, like, the film is over now. Like, there's a whole other film about his reentry process and how that's going to happen. But for me, I feel like victory had been made for her family, and the fight that Fox had been working towards for so long had been achieved. And so the film could end, not the conversation, but the film. And so then we went back after weeks, and sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, and edited for about 9 months.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Saidiya, you've described the Black cinematic as one way in which discrete, everyday, modern forms of Black life are sort of projected and known. Yet there is a kind of projection that can be experimented with and rehearsed and staged. And I think about the ways that Black people show up on social media, right? So we sort of master these forms of projection. And I want to ask you, with this film and Fox's own self-reflexiveness, is that compulsion and impulse to document her life over those 19 years. I'm just wondering, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I have. I was thinking about that actually as Garrett was speaking. Because I think that part of the critical practice we're involved in as Black folks, understanding the way knowledge is produced against us, is, building our own archives, building family archives, right? Preserving those documents and objects that can generate like a radically different picture of how it is we live. I think that the cinematic is really important for me as a historical thinker, because the cinematic is so much about how we build in time, how we work with time, how we sculpt with time. And clearly, even the young Sybil, Fox, rich then or not, is aware of what it means to document these significant moments in her family's life, right? So that she is, self-consciously, self-reflexively involved in creating a record. And I think that those then become materials. So, she, provided the materials to actually help, Garrett make this exquisite film. So I think that this is the way in which, we are writing history and telling stories for a radically different audience. And I mean, there's two things. There's a moment in the film which is really powerful when she's in the church and she's asking forgiveness from her mother, from her children, from her church family. And for me, that was such a powerful moment because it was like pushing back against, for me, a certain kind of carceral narrative, like, okay, confessing one's guilt and then asking a community for forgiveness. But this was about, the responsibilities and obligations we have to one another and what it meant, what that gesture meant. And it brought me, mind of kind of Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, a text that, where she really appeals to her daughter to understand and to forgive and to think about those choices. And I think that intimate archives are powerful because they are like how we address one another, how we try to, create a text for our children and for those who are not yet born. But I wanted to ask, Garrett, something in relationship to that. I don't know if I should wait, but I guess it was about the black and white footage, so that those tapes were originally that Fox gave you were in color, but then they're folded into the black and white, because there's something about the character of the black and white cinema that is so, elastic and richly suggestive and just kind of blends all these times together. So I wanted to ask you about the significance of black and white footage in creating the rich compounded time you work in, and that really we live in, that's how we experience time.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I think there's two answers to it. The first is kind of the most superficial, which is that when I was making Alone, Alone is black and white, and I had really thought of it as being a sister film. And so the whole time we were shooting with Fox and the family, to me, it was an intuitive thing where they needed to stay together formally. And so time was also going to be in black and white. And then when I was looking at the archive, it really changed all of that. And we played with it being in color. And I think that actually a lot of the choice to stay with it being in black and white really had to do with the music, and with the score, with Emma Hoy's score, because there was something, when I found Emma Hoy's music just on YouTube. She's a 96-year-old Ethiopian nun. She was a prisoner of war. She was, classically trained by European instructors and really created kind of a sound unto herself. And there was this one recording that was made in the 60s that she had done to raise money for an orphanage in Ethiopia, and she's still alive. And the music really just struck something inside of me, where I just unequivocally was like, these two women need to be together in this space. And for some reason, the color demanded too much. It almost, to a certain extent, the black and white not only allowed for there to be a level of fluidity, where it really felt to me like time could feel like a river as opposed to a collage, as opposed to something that we're bouncing back and forth around. It made it feel as time really feels inside of us, which is as memory, as something that's that isn't actually stuck in any kind of real time. Our memories are present inside of us, kind of at all moments. And so the music could be held; it could have a place equal to the imagery on some level, I felt. Yeah.
I think I won't ask that question because there's something about that non-linearity to this that I think is super successful. And thank you for I hadn't even considered the black and white adding to that. But I did want to ask Patrisse or Imani, and either one of you could speak to this, but Garrett and I talk a little bit about in her Q&A about Fox's attention to her hair, which I appreciate. There's something so Black about that, from her and her mother's references to it. And but there's also just this intimacy and this mundaneness that you're able to capture that feels loving. It doesn't feel ethnographic. It doesn't feel like an outsider. It's incredibly intimate. And so I was just curious if either of you had any perspective or on that observation.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things the ways I read the film, and Fox in particular, had so much to do with the way that she comported herself that was very particularly Southern, and in some ways particularly New Orleans, as well. This kind of remarkable composure and deep care presentation in the midst of incredible grief, right, and unbelievable stress. This sort of this sense of composure as a form of actually protecting oneself from the onslaught of the world, right? So it's not respectability as we tend to describe it, but actually sort of the creation of a barrier of sorts, and a refusal to swallow the indignity. And there's also, there's something about that for me as a viewer set against the particularity of Angola as a prison, right? As a prison that was a plantation, as a prison that has this incredibly long history of absolute brutality, right, and violence and cruelty, and that so this sort of in there are moments where it feels like a presentation functioned as a kind of armor in the face of that. And then there's another piece that I thought was really interesting, and I'd actually be interested in hearing some of Garrett's thoughts about this, which is, we get very early on Fox's story of this sort of aspiration to an American dream of sorts, right? And that they want to build, and they want to, develop this business and the like. And that aspiration, right, which is so sort of it is the narrative that is sold to Americans, right, as what we ought to be, but that actually is what sort of triggers, the encounter with law enforcement, even though they don't actually steal anything, right? They don't. It's a plan that is disrupted, and yet the consequence is incredibly brutal and violent. And then there's also the aspect of the dream, which is about a certain kind of domesticity and so you experience not just elusive is too gentle a word, but you experience the way the lie, right, of those narratives, and the lie of the idea that there's something, that the reason that they are inaccessible has to do with some form of deficiency on the part of Black folks. And the last point, I was so taken, and this is part of what I want to ask about, by the names of the twins and how they fit in the composition of the film. Because we get more, justice as just us. We see him more than we see freedom, right? And we see them both, but we hear more about justice. And so you actually feel that detail, you feel the just us quality, right? And freedom is more elusive. Like freedom is, so there's, sort of those ways of telling the story in this, in the material, pulling out of the archive to craft a story about what has happened with a gentle hand, but such a powerful structure. Just I found that really striking. And I'll stop.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, I think, that you just said in there that is even just awakening my own mind. I mean, just in terms of, in many ways, the archive also is what, was Fox's way of continuing the American dream. I mean, and this whole idea of what is wholesome, I think, is a really interesting idea, that we have certain aesthetic around what being an American looks like, and being a wholesome American looks like. And Fox, I think, was very pointed in making sure that she documented these moments that I think fit into those same ideas, those same ideals and those same aesthetics around how we see ourselves or don't see ourselves, you know? And I just can't emphasize enough that I think that there is, and I was talking about this also with like Huey Copeland, it talked about just what it means to work with archive in this context in a way that really challenges the idea of the auteur, of the sort of the singular vision of the director. And I think that there is this incredible part of what I'm so excited by is that to me this is a merging of like our souls. It's like a merging of Fox being a director, of being a filmmaker herself, and our two films coming together to create this new definition of America, of what's wholesome, of what family is, justice and freedom. I mean, all of the boys, it was really, at this point, it's funny because by the time we started filming, obviously most of the sons were off doing their own thing. Remington was, at Maori. Lawrence was in ROTC. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Is it ROTC? The military?
Yep.
Okay, I'm just like, Garrett, you don't want to say those letters. And everyone was kind of scattered out. The twins were both going through college, and little Rob was mostly the one that was at home. Malik was in New Jersey. So the archive also was one of those things where I myself could never capture that. I could never tap into not only the moments in which the family was in a sort of under one home, under one. As you're speaking to, it was also Fox's youth, Fox's vulnerability, her a part of her character that had not yet been sort of I don't want to say thwarted, but I think that there was less of a need for her to present herself in this way that was sort of hyper exceptional, which I think is what the system requires many families to do, as this sort of presentational quality that is so tied to your survival and so tied to the unification of your family. In many ways, it was the person that I met was a result of those requirements. And I say that lightly because I also think that Fox and her family are very much themselves and individuals, and very much held on to who they were, but when you see this sort of wild child, wild spirit at culture, in the 90s, and then you meet this very controlled woman in the mid 2000s, I think it's also a reflection of the system, and of that full trajectory.
Yeah, Patrisse, did you want to take a shot at it, or?
Yeah, I can also answer another question.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm like,
sure.
I don't know what to add to that. I guess something that have been thinking about that I think is so important is how this film centers with like her, this lead woman, in this way that we don't see very often, if at all, when in relationship to the carceral state. It's often boys or Black men being at the center of that conversation. And so I think that archival footage, just learning and doing the research beforehand, that it wasn't the original plan, and like, just look at God, like divine, this moment of like, well, actually there's more, and there's more that you can see. And I think the more that we see is her, and her positioning, and she reminds me a lot of my mother. Both the archiving, my mother is a big archiver, not of footage, but of paperwork. When every single family member of mine had some interaction with the state, whether it was the police or the carceral system, she wrote everything down. She was the person who would make all the phone calls, and there's stacks and stacks of paperwork of like names of the officer, names of the doctor, phone numbers to call, the notes, like verbatim notes of what happened between them. And that, for me, has so much to do with us being not believed, and like how much we have to put our story together to be believed, to be seen in a particular way. And I feel like it is so hard to tell the story about Black women without, for me, so many films that I've seen that tell the story of Black women who've been impacted by incarceration often leave me wanting. And this film doesn't leave me wanting. It leaves me feeling like I see myself in her. I see my family in her. There's so much clarity, even like my own childhood, and like, oh, whoa, I think that's like what my mom was experiencing. I think that's what she felt. And we don't get to see that as young Black girls. And I think there's something about this film that does something as a child of, incarcerated father who, my mother really had to hold it all together, as most Black women do. That was a new perspective to see projected back to me, outside of my own home. And I think there's something really, really powerful and rich in that.
Thank you. So I'm going to skip around a little bit because you all are bringing up things that I had, but there's one question that we're running out of time and I'm like dying to get out. But Imani, you brought up the twins, Freedom and Justice. And I know that you also have a child named Freedom, and Patrisse, you have a child named Shine. And I think about that section of Daughters of the Dust when they are, listing my own and I own her, and this tradition of allocating hope unto our children via their names. And I was curious for you how you relate to Fox's story as mothers, and if you could just talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. My son is named Freeman, but it is in some sense rates that it is a name that is of an ancestor who gave himself that name after escaping slavery and became an abolitionist. So this idea of sort of announcing oneself, one's sort of the value of freedom and naming is I do think that's a very deliberate parental practice. And for me, my name means faith, and for my parents it was faith in the movement, right? So this idea that naming has a politic attached to it, but also a hopefulness, in a condition that is often sort of terrorizing, right? And so that and terrifying, right? And how does one have? I was very kind of moved by watching the way that Fox parented, without lectures, but it became very clear in the relationship with a sense of possibility, right? And so for me, I talk about what fortune when I wrote a book that was a letter to my sons, not as accumulation of material things, but the fortune of inheriting these sort of legacies of creativity and resistance and possibility, notwithstanding the violence of this society. And that I think that resonated at perhaps for me the deepest level, right? What does it mean to come of age? I actually kept thinking about the film alongside Jasmine Ward Singh and Buried Singh, and I think because that is a sort of coming of age novel in which you're living with the hauntings of the destruction and violence faced by earlier generations of Black young people, right? That is always, I actually thought about that in terms of the black and white of the film, because this negative space feels like a kind of haunting, right, around you, that there's always something over your shoulder. And that is the reality of what it means to rear children. And it's also a reality. I mean, I also really appreciated that Fox had been incarcerated and talked about that as well, because it's not only a haunting for the prospect of you're young, it's a haunting for the prospect of being able to take care of your young, right? And the same with Rich.
Back. I was just gonna say that, you know, as someone who grew up in over police and neighborhoods, and who's had most of my family in and out of prison or jail system, on probation, parole, living, in and out of court, that as a mother, it's a constant sort of question about, like, is this the right place to raise a child? Is this the safest place? Is this, can I keep them from the jaws of the carceral state? And I think that this film just brings that up for me. What our options are as Black moms, and what kind of what it means to raise Black children here. There's a lot of, like, philosophical and ideological questions I have about it, and as an organizer and as someone, I helped raise my nephew when his father was in prison. I spent a lot of time trying to negotiate which institutions to dodge in order to keep my nephew out of the carceral system. So we chose to homeschool him his entire, pretty much from junior high through high school, as a protective measure from the school to prison pipeline. And those types of things that, non-Black parents, mostly white parents, and don't have to think about. And so I'm just recognizing that, and recognizing that it's the kind of conversation that I think a lot of Black moms and mothers of Black children are consistently trying to figure out, how do you protect your child from these systems.
Thank you.
Another moment on this note in the film that really touched me is when Fox is in the car. I don't know if it's with Remington. He's going to kindergarten, and he says, "Mom, you won't have to hold that because I'm going to carry it for you." And in that moment, it was like, the child's recognition of all his mother is carrying. And even as a kindergartner, he wants to lighten her load. And it was, again, such a powerful articulation. And the second thing is related to something that Imani said. I too was thinking about Sing Unburied Sing as I was watching the film, and I think that there are at least two shots of the Angola ferry landing. And the first time we're going across, but that space is, redolent with, like, centuries of, like, Black, domination and suffering and death. So I could hear those voices that Jessamine Ward summons in that novel, just seeing that shot and just the way the camera moves through that space, and we come back out of it towards the end of the film. And that was also just, incredibly redolent, again, not just with this story, but with, generations and centuries of these stories of captivity and loss and death and love.
Yeah, I just want to add to that really quickly, and just saying that, in thinking about the absence and presence of what existed in terms of the history of this family, but also just the history of the entire transition point from slavery to the incarceration system, the visual elements from which I could actually, or we could articulate that, were very limited. And so in reference to Angola, part of the weaponry of the prison system is that it is something that is really visually on lockdown. I mean, you can't even get a drone over a lot of these prisons, so you can't see. There's a real lack of being able to just see. And so, I that was one thing that I found, incredibly, was really important, and was also probably the hardest part of this whole process, was how can we show the 18,000 acres of plantation that have become Angola? And that one shot that we see in the film is a fraction of what is there. And we couldn't even, we had to drive to Mississippi, fly a drone over Mississippi, and that was all we could get. We still couldn't even, in a 8K camera encapsulate the scale of that of what existed there. And so, and I also think that and this is a probably a much larger conversation to have, but I think sometimes younger generations in trying to understand what it meant to be an enslaved person in America in a landscape that you didn't know, and then to be able to actually see the landscape of Louisiana, of that swamp, how one could even possibly move through that, I think was also really important to have some kind of visual attachment to, because it's not something that I think we have reference for strategically and on purpose,
Thank you. I just have one more question, and then again, I don't know if you all have any questions for each other, but I think, and I'm going to try to combine a few here, but there's something about, we've been talking about abolition, obviously, in pop culture lately for all the obvious reasons. And I think what this film does really successfully is think about not only what it is like for people to be incarcerated, but I think some of the things you've been bringing up, what the calling the case managers, the dealing with the lawyers, the dealing with the disappointments from judgments, and also for Fox, advocating at events, and now for some of her children, also bringing these things to light. And so I think about the ways that the film is shedding light on the impact on families. But also, I think there's another question here about how Black life is generally conscripted as unlawful, right? And so, Imani, you brought up earlier, how their attempt to live this, dream is sort of what triggers the events that comes to this, but how their punishment, I don't even want to use that word, but what they endure because of that, which isn't, as you say, isn't successful. I mean, I think there's just so much there around just the unfairness, right, of Black life, and also thus the unfairness of the carceral state on Black families. So I don't know if anybody has any last thoughts on those things, which was not exactly clear, but that's, yeah, I'll leave you with that.
Can I
Well,
actually
I
would love. Okay.
no, please, no.
Oh no, I was going to ask about, because it's like volunteering Saidiya, but because you write so profoundly about unlawfulness, I would love to hear how your thoughts.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that part of that kind of fundamental unlawfulness. Someone like Fred Moten has spoken of like an criminality, is about what does it mean to try to live at all in a context that's predicated on your expected death, your disposability, your containment. So I think that that's a part of that fundamental unlawfulness, and as well, I mean, I think that the freedom longings and dreams that we've all spoken of today, is has a fundamentally antagonistic relation to the social order in which we're living. So to desire, freedom, I mean, was literally unlawful and a crime in the context of, the kind of legitimate property in Black life. So I think that there's something about unlawfulness that isn't about some, deviation from the norm, but about actually a set of aspirations that would totally topple what are the norms, that would totally unsettle the order. And that's the part of the unlawful that I think we need to kind of hold on to and appreciate. I mean, recently with John Lewis's death, people were embracing again the language of what does it mean to be a troublemaker? What does it mean to actually set upon a plan of action that is explicitly against the terms of the order, and our freedom is tethered to that. So that's the way I would want to think about the unlawful, and encourage us to be unlawful, to be troublemakers, and to kind of like step out there in a way that's utterly antagonistic to the governing norms.
So there's a kind of optimism in that, right? Because there's an optimism that it's possible to, yeah.
Yeah.
And now I want to
Garrett.
call on Patrisse.
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with all of that, all of the unlawfulness. My spirit is really on what's happening in Kenosha and what's happened in Minneapolis, and how this iteration of this movement has really challenged everything that we understand about how to build movement and how to change systems. And we're in probably the first time in my lifetime where the conversation about policing, like where the conversation about abolition is an actual mainstream conversation, and that people, elected officials in particular, are being forced to really come to terms with what their police departments have done, what they've created, what they've upended, what they've destroyed in people's spirits and people's communities. And I think that it's been the challenge from this movement to cut all ties with respectability, cut all ties with the idea of police as normal, and really positioning a new system. What will it take to put a new system in place, not reform the one that exists, not try to fix and tinker with it, but get rid of it altogether. And it's profound. It's profound, and it's not folks are not letting up. And I think that this film feels like a part of that lineage. It's going to be in the canon, that we can come to and look at as part of this larger conversation around the police and carceral state.
Yeah, Imani or
Yeah,
Garrett, do you have
yeah.
party? Thank you.
I was just gonna say that there's just were both such beautiful insights, and it reminded me of how, particularly just what Patrisse just said, the centrality of imagination to liberation, right? So, we often talk about, and we should, right, the structures of domination, but fighting for freedom is an imaginative process. That's why art is so central to it, right? You have to envision that which has not yet existed. And for me, it takes me back to this idea of time, because what it requires is an investment in a future that is unsure, that you don't know when it will be realized, there's not a kind of preordained plan to get there, right? But you have to continue to imagine something different, something quite different.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's much to add to those three meditations. I just feel like, in the context of both the film and I think just the world right now, that the way in which we resist, the way our relationship to abolitionism is also generational. And I think that, speaking with Miss Peggy, for instance, Fox's mother, and her perception and the way in which she felt her daughter should resist was very different from the way Fox felt she should resist. And in some ways is slightly different from even the way that Freedom is seeking to make that change as well. And so, I just think it's a testament to the family, and a testament also to where we're at in this current moment, of being able to not criticize past efforts or the approach in which we've taken as being soft necessarily, but to understand it as as what's allowed us to get to where we are in this current moment, and the possibilities that we're in, and yeah.
Well, thank you all. There aren't any questions. Apparently, there are just lots of loving comments of people wanting this to go on forever, which is not possible. Yeah, I think I knew we only had an hour, so we've kind of kept this pretty short. But I just want to thank you, Garrett, for making this film, and thank you, Patrisse and Imani and Saidiya, for agreeing to do this, and sharing this morning.
Yeah.